right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. This is a huge room. Wow, I didn't expect something this big. Welcome. My name is Aaron Schakowsky. I'm a senior program manager on the enterprise client management team, aka the System Center Configuration, well, realistically, the System Center Configuration Manager team. Yes, we exist. Yes, we are here. Yes, the product is still alive. I'm here to talk to you today about specifically OS deployment and configuration manager, as well as the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, or MDT. Our team owns both of those products, and we've got a lot of new things that we want to share with you today. So what I'm going to be talking about is, just like the title says, what's new with those two products? What are the investments that we're making with them? What are some of the new things we're adding specifically for Windows 10? And again, that we're continuing to work on these. We're continuing to address a lot of the pain points that we hear from our customers and a lot of the feedback that we received. So first, I am going to click the thing. There we go. First, I'm going to talk about MDT and where we are today with that. So this is the current state of things with MDT. MDT 2013 was released last year to support Windows 8.1. And we still support MDT 2012 Update 1 because of its legacy support for some of those additional operating systems that are still out there. So going forward, we will be superseding support for adding MDT 2013 Update 1, and that will be the primary version that is supported as an active version. We'll retain support for MDT 2012 Update 1 in order, for customers that still are on Config Manager 2007, that still support Windows Vista. They do exist. So MDT 2013 Update 1 will work with the Windows 10 ADK, but that has support for Windows 10 all the way back to Windows 7. And then if you see here at the bottom, we do have a KB that lists our support lifecycle for MDT. I don't think we've updated it yet for Update 1, but that'll be coming shortly. And that goes in a lot more explanation in terms of what we support and why we support for MDT. Okay, so MDT 2013 Update 1, we released a preview of this back in March, and there's a link here in the deck to that blog post on the MS Deployment blog, which is our blog for MDT. And that relies upon the Windows 10 ADK preview, which was originally available on the Download Center, though the Windows guys took that down, as some of you noticed, and moved it over to the Windows Insider program. So you do have to get the ADK preview from there now. And like I said, that version of the ADK supports deployments of Windows 7 through Windows 10. And the preview right now, it only supports LTI. So a lot of folks have asked, hey, can I integrate this in with Config Manager? Which version should I use? Yada, yada. The MDT 2013 Update 1 preview is LTI only. It might work in ZTI and UDI in some situations, but honestly, we didn't go through test pass on those scenarios. So if you're finding issues with those scenarios, I wouldn't be surprised. It's not to say we're dropping ZTI and UDI at this point. We just haven't done those test pass yet, and we'll get to that before RTM. There's a blog post here as well for some updates that are needed to support Windows builds greater than 10,041. Later builds, I think it was like 10,060 something or other, fixed some of the issues that existed in WinPE for the MSHTA, but there are still some script updates that you need to support Windows 10 build versions that are greater than 5 digits. So we had some interesting bugs where we were expecting a 4-digit build number and things were falling over when that went to 5. So make sure you grab those if you're going to continue to test with later builds. And then for RTM, right now we're targeting around the same time as Windows 10 RTM. And at that time, we will also then add in support for the Windows 10 in-place upgrade scenario. We're working on that right now, and that will come in the RTM release. I don't have it on the slide, but we will also, we're also targeting another release later this year around the same time as the Config Manager vNext. We have a great dependency as well on Config Manager, and so we'll need to update our bits at that point as well. What's the blog post? There's a link there that goes to the MS Deployment blog. which just gives you information. So the first one is the sort of release notes, the announcement of the preview. The second one is a link to the MS deployment blog as well on the updates that are required for those newer versions of Windows. So assuming the deck gets published at some point, you can go and click on that and see more information. Or just go to blogs.technet.com/msdeployment, and these two posts will be the first 2 or 3 that are up there. So what's included? Lots of bug fixes. We continue to work on bugs and try to fix as many bugs as we can. We have gotten some additional engineering assistance on this recently, so someone who is very familiar with the product and is able to spend some time working on some targeted fixes. So we're continuing to work on bugs. We have updated the task sequence engine. So if you actually looked at the version of some of the task sequence binaries in MDT 2013, and then if you know your versioning from Config Manager, it was actually for Config Manager 2007, I think SP2, which is like 2009. So we have updated those binaries. So in the preview, you should see a much more up-to-date. And then at RTM, the RTM of MDT will be the service pack binaries that we'll be releasing for Config Manager next week. And then we'll get into a better habit of updating those as we go along. Okay, I wonder if the batteries are dead on that. We got a lot of requests from customers to add split WIM support. And so we added that. That's specifically for the standalone UEFI scenario where the FAT32 partition can't handle greater than 4 gigs. So the story today with the preview is that if you create an image or you try to do this with an image that's greater than 4 gigs, we'll automatically split it for you. We've gotten some feedback already that, hey, that may not be desired in every situation. So we'll be continuing to work on that and refine that for the RTM. But the good news is we do have split WIM support now. I guess you're going to work sometimes. Okay, and then we completely revised the Windows versioning logic. As we got into testing with Windows 10 builds and they changed the version of Windows 10 to actually version 10, discovered that all of the MDT scripts use string comparison. And if you do any scripting or coding, you'll know that a string comparison, 10 is actually less than 6. So that caused a whole lot of problems in pretty much every script that we had. So we had to go through and change everything over so it was doing an integer comparison as opposed to a string comparison. So we ended up creating a new function. For those of you that are into the gory details and... Oh, I went too fast. Gory details, you can see here we've added a new function, and that'll be used then throughout all of the other scripts for being able to get those details. So there might be some instances where if you're writing a custom script or you need to do something specific, you can leverage those variables as well. All right, so a couple more things to talk about here, but instead of talking, I want to show you. Oh, good. Okay, so this is the workbench we all know and love. And so just a few cosmetic things. You'll see some of the branding has changed, so we're not going to have the Solution Accelerator brand anymore. You're not going to see the old System Center mesh. So on a lot of different surfaces, the default Windows PE background is different. You'll see some new icons there. In the Information Center, you can see we're short a few items here. We've gotten rid of the Getting Started node, and we've gotten rid of the Components node. Those really kind of outlived their purpose, so we decided to remove those. The documentation, I'll see if Zoom It will work for me here. I'll move down to the bottom. You see down at the bottom here, this link actually goes to TechNet. So we put all of the documentation for MDT up on TechNet, and now all of the documentation links inside of the console go straight to TechNet. So you'll be getting the live content. The chum files will be removed from the product. For those of you that work in an environment that does not have internet access, like my lab right here, these links obviously won't work for you. And we're talking with our doc team about the possibility of generating a chum file for use. There is also a neat trick you can do in TechNet to export a whole bunch of content. So we do have some options there. So then the other thing that I wanted to show you while we're in the workbench here as a bit of a demo, first let me show you what version we're working with. So this is actually an updated build. This is a build from late last week. And I wanted to give you kind of a sneak peek of some of the stuff we're working on. If you remember from a previous slide, I mentioned that we are working on an in-place upgrade scenario for Windows 10. So I grabbed one of the later builds. Not done yet. There's still some fine-tuning to do, but I wanted to give you an idea of what we're working on here. So you can see I've already added an OS for Windows 10. I also have one here for Windows 8, just your normal standard process for importing an OS. This is the full source files, so it's everything that you would get off of the ISO. And I'm going to create a task sequence. Maybe, if my lab behaves. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we'll call you, if I can spell, upgrade, Win10 upgrade. Now we have a new template, standard client upgrade task sequence. So we have a new template that you can select. And then as you step through here, it'll prompt you for the OS. Now you notice it's only showing the Windows 10 OS. It's not showing that Windows 8 OS. This scenario will only work with Windows 10 and above, so we're filtering on that. Some of these other screens, this still needs some revision. I'm going to skip this. This is completely irrelevant. We need to get rid of this. Same here, completely irrelevant. We need to get rid of it. And then next. And we've created a task sequence. So let's just take a quick look at that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I'll talk a lot more about this a little bit later. But I just wanted to give you a quick peek into some of the work that we're doing here to support the Windows 10 in-place upgrade scenario. Obviously need to give my lab a little more memory. So if you're familiar with the upgrade task sequence that we published on our blog last year, or some of the other work that we've been doing, this will look very familiar. A lot of the same sort of steps and content. You know, we have the ability to validate the system ahead of time. We have a new step that we've added for upgrading Windows, for upgrading the OS, where you can specify the OS to use as the upgrade. And then a post-processing group where you can, do updates and install applications and all that good sort of stuff. We'll handle rollback, do all the things that you would expect during an in-place upgrade. So again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just wanted to give you a quick peek into some of the new stuff that we're working on. All right, so that's all I've got about MDT. I'm going to move on now and talk about Config Manager and OSD. And first I'm going to talk about some of the improvements that you're going to see in the product with the service pack that we'll be releasing next week. So first, how would you complete this sentence? Hard, I heard. Speak up. Awesome, I love it. It's our MVPs in action. Thank you very much. All right, so I went with complex. OSD, or not, okay? Sorry, my clicker is not behaving today. So I went with complex. OSD, we know it's complex. We know that there's some challenges. And in a lot of respects, it's just the nature of the beast, I think. There's a lot of components. There's a lot of moving parts. We're trying to do what we can to hear your feedback, hear your pain, and try and make some improvements. Some of that I'll show today, and hopefully that will resonate. It is something we know. We understand that this is hard, right? We do this all the time ourselves. So some of the improvements that we've made with the service pack, certainly number one is support for Windows 10. You apply this service pack, this will be the min bar for Windows 10 support. So if you need to start deploying Windows 10, then you'll need to at least be on the service pack. We've made some improvements to our driver management, and I'll do a demo of that, of what we're adding. We're making the task sequence more resilient. Specifically, if there's an update that might cause multiple reboots, you might be familiar with that. We've done some improvements to how, hold that. We've done some improvements to the logging and how it's consistent throughout the process. If you deploy a required OS deployment task sequence, we've added some additional logic and some additional guidance to help control that and make sure that you're actually doing something that you want to do and not a career-limiting move. Okay, So with Windows 10, out of the box, the service pack will support the 8.1 ADK. That will be the prerequisite for setup. And if you want to deploy Windows 10, then you'll need to follow the directions that we have posted on TechNet. They've been up there for a while on how to customize that boot image for use. So it's a process by which you would install the Windows 10 ADK on a separate system, export the bootwim, do some modifications with DISM. We've got all the instructions all outlined. And then you import that into Configuration Manager for use in deployments. Once it's imported there, you can't customize it in the console, and that just has to do with the supportability around the different versions of the ADK. However, once the Windows 10 ADK releases around the time of Windows 10 RTM, the service pack release will support the Windows 10 ADK. So you can then upgrade to the Windows 10 ADK, and you'll get the full capabilities of the Windows 10 ADK for deploying Windows 7 through Windows 10. You won't have to do this little dance on the side with the 10 ADK and import the boot image that way. We will also be supporting the Windows 10 in-place upgrade scenario with 2012 R2 SP1 using the similar sort of sample content, the sample task sequence, and PowerShell scripts that we published last year. We're working on revising those and hope to have those published soon. So it'll be a basic experience around the in-place upgrade, and I'll talk more about that later on in the session. For driver management, we focused on some specific areas when importing drivers and adding them to boot images. We fixed a number of bugs and DCRs directly from customers and our MVPs, and that we heard from support. So when you call in cases to support, that information does get back to us if there are areas of pain and areas of concern. There's also a very specific, there was one checkbox that was like update DPs, and it caused a lot of confusion for people because it said one thing, but it didn't always do that thing. So I think we've fixed that. I hope we fixed that. And I'll show you what I mean by that by doing a demo. Okay, so I've already gone through the process of starting the import driver wizard, and just because it takes a little bit to parse through the folder of drivers. But what you can see here in the screen is we have some additions to the UI. We show up at the top here the directory that you specified. So you know the context of where you are in this screen. And then if you notice down at in the file list here, we'll show the file names. Let me expand this out a little bit and then zoom back in. You can see we're now focusing on the right-hand side of the file path. Okay, so you'll know really the important piece is what's the name of the INF. Previously, you'd get a whole list here of the original source path, and you would have to scroll out or expand the list out. It was hard to see what was going on. So we've split that up so you get the context of where you are plus the specific instance of what you're looking at. Is there a question over here? Good question. The question is, can we see the driver version? Where's Ronnie? Did you prompt him? Did you pay him beforehand? So Ronnie, one of our MVPs, he's been hitting on us a lot about this. We don't show the driver version in this UI. We've gotten the DCR. We're working on it. I hope we'll get it into vNext. What we do have added here is we have added the class architecture and whether or not the driver is signed. You'll see this consistently across a lot of the UI that I'm going to show, and as you look around in the product, you'll see that consistent series of columns now as you see the drivers. I also want to talk briefly about the two checkboxes you see at the top, two filters that we've added. By default, we will filter out anything that is not signed. We want to make sure and we're guiding you towards using signed drivers. And additionally, it's off by default here, but you can enable a filter so that you're only showing storage and network drivers. So if you know that you're importing drivers that you want to add to a boot image, then you'll want to check that box to filter down only to those classes to make sure that you're only selecting things that are appropriate for a boot image. Now, that's not to say there might be some scenario where you want an audio driver in your boot image or you want a video driver. So you can still do that, but we're going to help you filter on that. So let me actually uncheck all of these. And I'm going to use this fantastic x86 modem driver for the purposes of demonstration. I'm going to skip the driver packages because what I can show you is all on the boot image screen. So I selected an x86 modem driver. I'm going to try to add that to my x64 boot image. Now, if you notice, there's no checkbox down here for update DPs when finished, so we got rid of that. We replaced it with this warning. So what we did here is we basically, that one checkbox and one little string of text, the functionality behind the scenes hasn't changed. When we talked with the engineers about this, their response was things were happening as designed. When we talked to customers, they're like, this doesn't make any sense, this isn't working. So we've changed things by adding this new warning so we can actually explain things a little better of what's actually happening and then give you the yes and no that you can respond appropriately. So in this example, I'll say no, and then I'm hit with this error. I'm blocked at this point because I'm trying to add an x86 driver to an x64 boot image. We're not going to let you do that, okay? It doesn't make any sense. There's absolutely no value, so we're just going to block that. All right, so I goofed. I selected the wrong one. I'll check the x86 now. So I get the prompt about whether I want to update DPs. Now I get another new warning. Are you sure you want to do this? This is a modem driver. You may not need this inside of this boot image. Normally, you only need network and storage drivers. So you can still go past this if you want, but we're at least going to stop you and ask you the question if this is really something you want to do. All right, so I'm just going to dump out of this wizard because that's really all I had to show you there. Yeah, question? When I say oh, yeah, so the question is when you're importing drivers and you hide them, does that mean that they're not selected? And yes, that should be the behavior, is that they would not be selected when you move forward. All right, so let me go real quick into the boot image properties to the driver tab. You can see here we have the class architecture signed. You'll see that consistent throughout a lot of different surfaces. Again, class architecture signed. And here we've added 3 new checkboxes. 2 of them are the same, and the third one is the matching architecture. So we know that we're dealing with a boot image here, so we're going to also filter on things that are not appropriate for this architecture. You can uncheck these if you want, obviously, and really that's just for full visibility. In the case of the architecture, we're still not going to let you add it. We'll still throw the same warning here, or the same error and block it. But at least you can have some visibility into the drivers in your driver catalog, so there's no confusion that like, wait a minute, I just imported this driver, why isn't it showing up here? So you can still have that visibility. And if you go through the process of grabbing, let's say, a network transport driver, it'll still warn you and say, are you sure this may not be necessary here? So all of the same sort of behaviors are added there as well. All right, let's go back to the deck. I imagine a lot of you probably know this KB article very well. Yeah, boo hiss. For those of you that don't, if you haven't hit it yet, it's kind of amazing, but there is a number of software updates that will cause multiple reboots. And when you do that in the context of a task sequence, it actually breaks the task sequence such that it'll stop running. And even worse, the client is stuck in provisioning mode. So effectively the system is completely unmanaged and you haven't finished off the end of your task sequence. So that's really bad. The workaround today is to not include those as part of the task sequence and exclude those, and it's caused a lot of pain. We fixed the issue with the provisioning mode. So if this were to happen, the client won't get stuck in provisioning mode. So that was one aspect that came out of this. We've also added a new listener. So the task sequence engine will now listen to Windows. And if Windows provides a notification through a common channel, common API, that the system is going to restart or shut down, then we'll intercept that. We need about 1.5 seconds. Obviously, that's going to be hardware dependent, but for the most part, we need a little under 2 seconds in order to save our environment. So save off all the information and all the variables and everything, such that our state is saved. And then and what that means is that when the system comes back up, the task sequence state is there, and the task sequence engine can read from that and recover and continue the task sequence. So the catch then is, well, which step do you run? Do you run the step that it was on previously before all this happened, or do you go on to the next step? So what we've added is a new option. This is only on the install apps or install updates step. And this will allow you to configure, if this issue occurs, whether you retry that step or whether you go on to the next step. And you can even specify the number of times you could retry. I think we limit that up to like 5 or something. That's probably a bit extreme, but who knows. And the reason that this is only on those 2 steps, the install apps and install updates, is because those are really the only 2 steps in the task sequence that can handle that sort of retry. If it comes to the point, if you have some good scenarios where you would want this on like install packages or run command line or something like that, let us know, and we can look at adding that in the future. But that would then require a lot of work on you to make sure that whatever package you're installing or command line you're running has the logic to be able to handle a retry. All right, moving on. We have improved the logic for when the task sequence logs what's going on. Today, you get things from different places, and the logs can change size throughout the process, and it can be a little confusing. You can sometimes lose data. If you start with a really large log size and then you install the client, it drops to the defaults, and you end up purging a bunch of data. So there's a lot more stuff that I had hoped that we could do here. In, one thing like a common logging directory, but we didn't get all the things in that we wanted to. So at the very least, we focused on size. So it depends, the first part of the initialization depends upon the scenario of where it starts. So if it is a refresh, an upgrade, or a non-OSD, the client is there, and we will use the settings that come from the client. So if the client is installed with defaults, then we'll start with that. If you've installed the client with 10 megs and 10 history, then the task sequence will use that. Now, in a bare metal situation, there is no client, so we'll use whatever the bare metal defaults are. If you've added the SMS ts.ini to define some custom log settings, then we'll use that. One little side note here, if you create an SMS ts.ini file and you put it into the boot directory on your site server, when you upgrade your boot image, we will automatically consume that. So the same as we do today with the WinPE shell.ini, we will now do with the SMS ts.ini. Task sequence runs. We'll make sure that you at least have a base minimum setting. Okay, so if you're using the defaults from the client, we're not going to continue forward a 250K log. We're going to bump you up to a base minimum. If your client is configured with a greater amount, like I said, 10 megs or something like that, then we'll use those. Okay, but it will at least get you up to a base minimum. And then when the task sequence completes, depending upon the scenario, is how we will leave the state of it. So if it's a refresh or bare metal, there is an explicit client install. So if you configure the defaults there, then we'll use the defaults. We'll reset the system back to defaults. If you explicitly set logging parameters on the CCM setup command line, then we'll use those explicit parameters. In an upgrade or a non-OSD scenario, there's not an explicit client install, so we'll just use the settings that came from the old system, the down-level system, and we'll persist those through. This might make a lot more sense if I go through an example. So let's take refresh. It's a very common scenario. We start with the client. Let's say it's the default. It's 250K in size, and there's 1 history. The task sequence starts. We bump it up to 2 megs and 2 history. Now, some might say that's still too small. You can customize it yourself. We got a lot of feedback from support, from our MVPs, and a lot of others. And went for this. It was a good median of all the responses that we received. And it also helps support a lot of low footprint scenarios. Now, during the task sequence, this is a refresh scenario, so CCM setup will be called. This is not good syntax, for those of you that know the parameters. It's just good for demonstration purposes. So you specify 1 meg in size and 5 history as part of the parameter. Well, wait a minute, that's different than what we started with. Doesn't matter. We will store those settings, and we'll continue to use the same size and history that we started the task sequence with. So you can ensure that all the way through the task sequence, you will have the same logging all the way through. And then because you specified those parameters on the command line, we'll use those and we'll set those on the client once the task sequence completes. So those are the changes that we've made to task sequence logging. All right, so let's say you're a real experienced SCCM admin. You've been doing this for years, right? So you create a task sequence, does wipe and load. It's installed in Windows 7 because that's, you're deploying that all over the place now. You go to deploy the task sequence, and okay, I want this to go to everybody in the company, so I'll choose all systems. Oh, and then I got interrupted. I'm talking to somebody, and then, oh, I'm up, so I'll go get some coffee, I'll get some water, go use the toilet, I'll come back. And I'm like, what was I working on again? I was deploying something. Well, I'll say it was required. And I'll next. I do this all the time, right? So you might be looking for a new job now. You might want to go update your resume. So we have a new feature that we've added called deployment verification. The goal of deployment verification is to protect the assets, even at the cost of an administrative workflow. So it might be a little more pain on the front end, or on the back end, I guess, for the IT admin, but it'll help save your job. We're categorizing a task sequence, an OSD task sequence, as a high-risk object. So we have this new terminology of a high-risk object. We might expand this in the future to other objects, but at least for now, any task sequence that's configured for OSD, so if it has a boot image associated with it, or if there are certain steps that are added to it, then it will be a high-risk object. If you deploy that high-risk object as required, that is a high-risk deployment. And then we will give you criteria by which you can define what, for you in your environment, for your business, what do you categorize as a high-risk collection. Typically, that's going to be by size. So by default, we will set 100 as the min bar for a warning, but we'll also give you the ability to block it, to say, you know what, you're not doing anything above a maximum level. We're going to filter on collections that contain servers, make sure we warn you on that, and then we'll give you an option as to what the behavior is if a collection contains a config manager site server. We want to make sure we're protecting our assets as well. Well, your assets of ours, right? So let's take a look at what that looks like. Yeah, we'll get to that. All right, so I've got my Windows 7 deployment task sequence here. Thank you. Cancel that. Okay, Windows 7 deployment. I go to deploy it. So immediately, even when I go to select a collection, not F1, sorry, wrong one, I get a warning. Hey, this has potential to be a high-risk deployment. You're deploying an OS. So we're going to filter some of your view. And this is configured as part of the site properties. So if I'm an OS deployment admin, my role as an OS deployment admin, and I get this, and I could proceed here, or I could pick up the phone and call my site admin and say, hey, what's this deployment verification thing on the site properties? So let me actually back out of this. Let's go over and take a look at what that is. So as the site administrator, you can define for the entire site on the properties of the site, there's a new tab for deployment verification. A couple things to call out here. The first up at the top, high-risk deployments are always limited to custom collections and the built-in all unknown computers collection. In other words, you cannot deploy a high-risk object as a high-risk deployment to all systems. Can't do it. If you need to do that, you'll have to create your own collection that's limited on all systems. You'll have to create a custom collection. The only built-in collection that we're going to show you is the all unknown computers. Any other built-in collection cannot be used for this purpose, and you're going to have to create your own collection. Now, this doesn't affect other types of deployments, okay? So if you're deploying apps, deploying updates, you can still do that to those collections. But specifically for high-risk deployments, we're going to limit that. In the middle here, oh, I didn't update. Sorry, guys. This is what it looks like by default. Sorry. I forgot to reset my lab. So by default, the minimum is 100, okay? So if you have a collection that's greater than 100, by default, we're not going to show that in that selection wizard that I was just on, and I'll go back to in a minute. You could set this to 0 if you want. If you don't care about the size of collections, you can drop this to 0, and your admins can deploy to any collection of any size. So for example here, the maximum size is effectively turned off. We're not going to block anything by default. You have to, or at least in terms of size. But you have that there if you want to be able to specify that. and there's some interesting combinations here. I'm going to zoom out just for editability. So if I set these both to 0, that effectively means size doesn't matter. You can deploy to as little or as big. Thank you, Ronnie. You can deploy to as little or as big of a collection as you want. If you set the default size to 1, that means for any collection, you will get warnings, and your workflow will be affected by doing a high-risk deployment. If I set the default to 0, and I set the maximum to 1, this disables OS deployments as required. You cannot do a required OS deployment with this configuration because it will block them all. Is there a question back here? Yeah. Good question. Yeah. So the question is this only for the console, or does this also affect SDK methods? And it is only for the console. So we're not going to block any automation. Automation is automation. If you're going to create automation, then you are in charge of that automation. And you can blow your foot off as much as you want. Yeah, question? Yep. Yep. So the question is, hey, I've got an empty collection. There's nothing in it. I create a high-risk deployment, and then I go in and I plug all systems into that collection. Today, we're not going to handle that. So today, all this does is this only addresses the creation of the deployment. We've got some other things that we've been thinking about in terms of additional monitoring and alerting that we can do after a deployment is created. So there's still some work to be done here, I think. But at least as an initial offering, this is just the initial creation experience. Another scenario that could occur is that if you have a collection that is based upon membership of an Active Directory group, that's owned and controlled by potentially a whole other set of administrators. So if they go and add all domain computers into that group, that's not something that might not even be in your control. So something to keep in mind. Again, some of the ideas we have around additional monitoring in the future might be able to address that, but for today, it's purely just the creation experience. Down here at the bottom, by default, we will block a high-risk deployment to a collection that hosts a site that contains a system that has a site server role in it. So any type of config manager system that is in a collection will block the ability to create a high-risk deployment to that collection. Okay, we want to make sure that we're protecting our servers. Your servers, with our software. But if there are, this was a point of massive debate on our team, whether or not we'd block by default, do we give you an option? We settled on this UI so that we could give you that option. So by default, it will block. But if you have some situation where you have a collection that has a config manager site server in it, and you have to do a required OS deployment to that collection, you can change this to warn, and that will then throw some of the warnings. So let me actually go back now that we see what some of those configurations are. Let's go through this and take a look at how that looks. So we get this warning. Okay, I understand. So I'm only showing 3 collections here. I have a lot more. You'll notice all systems is not here, and a lot of the other built-in ones. All unknown computers is. But I switched my number down to 10, so I'm hiding collections that are above that min bar. Okay, so I reduce that down to 10, and if I uncheck this, you'll see we get a warning here, hey, danger, Will Robinson, and we've got a new collection that popped up here. So I created a custom collection that's limited on all systems. So it's effectively the same as all systems. It contains all systems, but it's not the default all systems. So that now shows up. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go forward. And I'm going to specify this as required. Now as I step forward, get a new warning here. It says, hold up, this is bad. This is potential to be bad. You're doing something that's high risk. We've got more than your minimum number of resources. We've got site systems in here, and we've got servers. And the only reason that this is a warning and not a block is because I had changed that option in the site properties to warn. If it has been blocked, then we get an error here. For the sake of time, I'm going to not go through all the different iterations of this, but I wanted to show you the warning state that we get here. You'll also notice in this instance, if you have a high-risk deployment, you're not doing next anymore. Okay? There's not zooming through to the summary and being done. Okay? You have to check that checkbox in order to proceed. The OK button is grayed out. So you have to move your mouse, you have to click the checkbox, go back to the OK. And when you do that, that does generate an audit status message. So there will be a new message that's generated specifically for this purpose. So you can set up some alerts and fire off an email or something if that status message ever pops. So as a site administrator, you'd know right away, hey, this admin created this required OS deployment task sequence at this time. And you can pick up the phone and or call HR, whatever you want to do. All right, so I'm going to drop out of that and we'll move on. So that is deployment verification. Hopefully that's a benefit for a lot of you. Question here. The question was the ability to do like a workflow, like an approval. So I think of it like the military having two keys. I've got one key. Sorry, I've got one key. You've got one key. We both have to turn those keys. Yeah, we talked about that. That sort of workflow. It's not something that we do a lot of in Config Manager. Potentially something you might be able to craft together with Service Manager and doing that sort of workflow. We did talk about it, and but we did have to scope what we were doing just in order to get something out that's of use. So, okay, all right. So that was all of the improvements that are into the service pack that you'll get next, or that is being released next week. Next, I want to move on in the last half hour and talk about Windows 10 upgrade. So first, we'll talk about some of the reasons why upgrade is a good thing. There's a bunch of other sessions, I got them listed at the end, that will go into differing details on this, but I wanted to give you an overview of it from our perspective on why this is a good thing. So why upgrade? Well, if you don't already know, if you've been living under a rock, this will preserve applications, drivers, user data, and settings. All it does is it swaps out the OS. So you don't have to use USMT to try and worry about capturing user state and moving that around and reinstalling applications and all that. So that should help reduce a lot of your tests and prep for deployments. You don't have to go through a lot of the same sort of planning that you have for a traditional OS deployment. Compared to a refresh and more traditional wipe and load, upgrade is a lot faster. It's going to save a lot of time. In some respects, that speed is due to the fact that you're dealing with smaller content. You don't have to push all of your apps, all the user data around. All you're dealing with is the content that comes on the DVD, right? It's just that OS media. And upgrade is really robust. If something goes wrong during the upgrade process, it'll detect that. You might get a stop error, but if you reboot the system, it'll actually boot back into the previous OS. It'll roll back. And so it's much more resilient to problems. You won't leave the system as a brick, which today, if you're doing a deployment and you're in the middle of imaging and something goes wrong, that system's toast, right? Someone has to go out and lay hands in order to fix it. This is by far my favorite reason for doing this, is that there's zero ADK. The ADK isn't involved at all. There's no USMT, there's no Windows PE, there's no DISM. So those are great, powerful tools for other purposes, but in the context of upgrade, we don't need those tools. Is there a question? So the question was around group policy and the application of that on the down-level system versus the Windows 10 system. If there are common settings, then they would persist. Certainly if it's group policy that's being forced by the domain, then the domain will do its same thing and force those policies. If there are any new settings that are Windows 10 specific, then yeah, you would need to get new policies and apply those to the new system. Okay? And then, yeah. Yeah, so the question is about USMT and whether the user state migration is built in, and absolutely, it's just any user account. So effectively, take everything on the system, take out the OS, put in the OS, the new OS. Okay, so everything else will be retained. Just to be clear too, we're not deprecating or dropping any of our other scenarios. You can still bare metal, you can still replace all of those good fun things. This is just a new tool, okay? This is just, in some scenarios, this will be a way to make it a lot easier to get to the latest operating system. And certainly after Windows 10, or once you're on Windows 10, going forward from there, upgrade is going to be a lot more of a common practice. But even then, if you get a system that has no OS on the hard drive, upgrade doesn't help you there. So bare metal is still going to be a very common scenario, and even refresh in some respects. If the system is just in a bad state and you want to kind of start over and start fresh, upgrade's not going to help you there. Speaking of which, there are some situations where upgrade actually is not the solution. Primary one, I call this one garbage in, garbage out. If you've got a system, like I was just saying, it's in kind of a wonky state, it's got a bunch of junk on it you don't like, it's not behaving quite appropriately, upgrade's not going to fix that, okay? It's going to persist all of the apps and the settings that might be causing some problems. So a refresh is probably the best way to kind of start it over and refresh the system, right? And then there are some specific things. If you need to change domain membership, upgrade won't work for that. You have to, if you need to change domain membership, you've got to do a refresh. If you've got to swap out a whole bunch of apps, so if you've got a down-level system with a bunch of older apps and you want to go to Windows 10 with a bunch of new fancy apps, upgrade's probably not the best bet, because then you're going to have to go through the process in the task sequence of uninstalling all those old apps, and then upgrade the OS, and then install all those new apps. And it's going to be a ton of processing. It'd be a lot faster to just refresh the system and start from scratch. Next, if you've got to make some fundamental changes to your systems, you're going to need to refresh. The most common one that people have asked about is the architecture change. Unfortunately, you can't do an architecture upgrade. So you can't, if you're on Win 7 x86 and you want to go to Win 10 x64, you're going to have to refresh. Same with BIOS and UEFI. Yeah, I know, sorry. Same with BIOS to UEFI. If you're on legacy BIOS with Win 7 and you want to go to UEFI on Win 10, you're going to have to refresh. Even that, I've been talking with a few folks today about some of the challenges with that, and I think we still have some work to do there in OSD to improve the experience of shifting from BIOS to UEFI. But upgrade is not going to solve that. And finally, there's some things that OSD administrators like to do, customizing Windows PE and customizing your image. There's really no need to do that in an upgrade scenario. And honestly, you can't do it. I suppose you could boot into WinPE as part of the task sequence, but there's really not a whole lot of advantages there. And then finally, third-party disk encryption. Upgrade's not going to magically solve that problem. So the overall intent of this slide is, upgrade's great, but it's not a silver bullet. So don't expect it to solve all the world's problems. So like I said earlier, we will support a basic experience for upgrade in our service packs that are coming out next week. And this is basically what we posted to TechNet last year. It's a sample task sequence with some supporting PowerShell scripts. We'll continue to update those. We're working on those right now. So you should look for that on the Config Manager team blog in the near future. We're using the task sequence for upgrade because it's an existing process that's well known. The user experience is consistent, so they'll still see the common, wonderful task sequence engine, the Progress UI. And then finally, all the reporting and monitoring that the administrator does on the back end, that's all consistent as well. So let me walk through the task sequence as it is today. This is the sample that we've posted. And then, as I'll show you in a little bit, this will look very familiar. As you saw also with the MDT one, right? There's a lot of consistencies here. So the first two groups, this all runs on the down level system. So, Win 7, for example. We'll do some prep steps, and then we actually run setup as part of that upgrade Windows step. Oh, went too far. So the highlighted piece. This is the command line that we actually use. If you have been looking at this, this should be very familiar now. The auto upgrade that's required to move all those apps and settings and everything. The auto upgrade, don't change that, at least in a configuration manager scenario, because our SMS agent is considered an app. So if you do an upgrade and don't persist the apps, you're not going to persist the client. So if you want to continue the task sequence or continue to manage the system, you have to use auto upgrade. At least until we figure out a process by which you can install the client after upgrading. But at least for now, make sure you're using auto upgrade. Quiet, we want to make sure that we're not showing the Windows setup UI. In part, that's to focus the user experience on the task sequence, so it's a common experience. But also, the Windows setup UI does include a cancel button. So you don't want your users canceling that process in the middle of it. No reboot, as we talked about earlier. We need to make sure that the task sequence controls the restarts of the system. That's that step there a couple after the upgrade windows. Dynamic update, that feature, that allows setup to go get updated content for itself. Any last minute security updates that are needed, updated compat information, as well as drivers that might be needed. Unfortunately, that process doesn't work in the context of update management in in Config Manager. So we have to disable that. If you're not doing software update management in Config Manager, then you can enable dynamic updates as part of setup. The post-UB, post-rollback, those are the scripts that we use then to hook back in and restart the task sequence, which I'll show in just a second how that works. All right, so in the process then, we restart the computer. And what actually happens then is we go into a low-level WinRE state where Windows will actually perform that upgrade. Once that's done, it'll go through a couple of reboots. It'll go through the finalization. It'll actually go through UBI, the out-of-box experience. And at the end of that, post-UBI, it'll run setup complete. Out of setup complete, we repair our client, make sure that the client is in a working state. And then we restart the task sequence with a flag telling it that, hey, everything's good, we're on Win 10, let's go on to post-processing. So then it'll restart the task sequence in that post-processing group. So just as an example here is that install software update step. If you wanted to do additional actions on Win 10, this is the group to add those to. If you want to install applications or do additional configurations, that's where you would add them. Now, if something goes wrong, as I mentioned previously with the rollback, then once the system restarts, it'll trigger post-rollback and will run the setup rollback script. What that does is the client is still in a good state, so it really just restarts the task sequence and specifies a parameter to tell us, hey, go to the rollback group. So the task sequence will skip over the post-processing group and write to the rollback group. So that will also run on that down-level OS. So if there are other things that you need to do to the system in a rollback situation, this is the group that you add it to. Making sure to add it prior to the trigger rollback failure. That needs to be the last step in the task sequence. It actually forcefully fails the task sequence so that the reporting you get back is that the process failed, the upgrade failed. One example of something that you may want to do in rollback, copy logs is a common thing. If you uninstall an application during the preparation phase, you may want to consider reinstalling it during rollback. One that I've seen is some third-party antivirus security software that may cause problems with upgrade. You may need to uninstall that before you launch upgrade. Well, then if it does roll back, you may want to make sure that security software is put back on. Our own IT department has been dogfooding this now for, 8 months or so. So they've been working with this for a lot. Question here? It is only, so the question was, does the rollback triggered only when a rollback occurs, or is it just the normal part of the task sequence? That group will only run when setup triggers a rollback. So when something goes wrong with setup itself in WinRE, and it gives up and rolls back, and there's some very specific stuff in setup that triggers that rollback, then we'll capture that and we'll make sure that we enter only that rollback phase. Now, if you monkey around with the conditions on things, then it could change the experience. But so MSIT has been dogfooding this for a while. They've been using that same task sequence that you saw. That's what they've been using. Now, granted, they made a whole bunch of customizations like any good IT department will do, specific to their business requirements. But they've been using this for quite a while. And the good thing there is that we've then gotten a lot of really good feedback from them. We've been working very closely with them. The admins that actually administer the config manager site inside of Microsoft, they sit right down the hall from me. So we've got a great relationship, and we've been sharing a lot of knowledge and learning a lot from their experience with this. In January, with the JTP, they scaled up to 40,000 devices doing upgrade through this method. I'm not going to steal a whole lot of thunder here. Robert has a session tomorrow specifically on how Microsoft deploys Windows 10, and he's going to talk a lot about this scenario. So if you're interested in how Microsoft internally has done Windows 10 upgrades, go check out Robert's session tomorrow on that. Okay, so we got a little less than 20 minutes left. Oh, and just real quick, we have like 18 and a half minutes left. They have another event in here, and there's some union guys that are ready to strip the room. In like 18 minutes, they're going to cut us off, and we all need to get out, or else they start having to pay union guys overtime. So, if you guys have questions, we can go out into the hallway and do a little Q&A afterwards. Once we're done here, let's make sure we clear out and give them the room back. So let me try to get through this real quick. First, and this kind of goes for everything, but one of the big challenges with any new operating system is how do you know that your applications, that your environment is going to work with this, right? And it's been a challenge for years, and we're doing some work to try and improve that experience. In particular, the Windows team has added a new setup parameter. It's not available yet, but the code is checked in. They gave me the green light to talk about it. So don't go looking in the current builds. It's not there yet. But this will allow you to run setup without doing an upgrade. Okay, so you can deploy setup, you can run it, and have it report back any issues. Okay, so it'll come back and it'll tell you, hey, I found an app compat issue, or hey, I found a driver issue. Or it'll come back with an error code that means that it successfully checked compat, right? Because 0 means that it actually succeeded with an upgrade, so they couldn't use 0. But it'll be a well-known error code or exit code that the compat scan successfully ran and everything was okay. And right now we're currently working on, with vNext, how we're going to incorporate this, what guidance we'll provide so that you can easily add this into your process to be able to do some pre-flight assessments of systems to know that they're good to go for Win 10. One other piece, while we're on this slide, diagnosability of Windows setup right now can be a bit of a challenge. We're working with Windows on that to try and make it an easier process. If you were to run this and get back some error code, right now, today, it's a bit of a mystery to know, what does that error code mean? How do I find out what that is? If there is an app compat issue, where do I look to know which app is causing a problem? There's a lot of log diving to occur. There's some compat XMLs you have to go look at. So we're trying to make sure that all that information gets well documented by RTM so that at least you have some information available to go search and look up and figure out what's going on. If you have questions, though, the config manager team has got a lot of experience with this now, so certainly reach out to us and we can help out with that. Also, the application compatibility toolkit will still be in the ADK. It'll be continued to be supported on Windows 10, so if you're using ACT, you can continue to use that. Or if you want to venture into that, you're welcome to. I'm not sure how long it'll be around, but at least for Windows 10, it will be there. And we're continuing to evolve this and continuing to work on this with Windows folks. I think there's a lot more that we can do here, and I'm going to continue to push and try to get a better story around how you can assess that your systems are ready and compatible. All right, so in vNext, we've added a couple of new steps into the task sequence. As we were working through the process of designing the Windows 10 in-place upgrade scenario, we realized that we needed the ability to be able to get multiple types of packages. So let's say you're deploying upgrade, but you're deploying to different types of hardware, and you don't want to create a driver package that includes all of your drivers. And the way setup is designed, we actually have to be able to give setup drivers. So the whole auto apply thing isn't compatible with what we're doing today. So we needed the ability to be able to dynamically get different types of content depending upon the situation. So decided to move some things out to a new step. And in doing so, we thought, you know what? We've got a lot of really smart customers and MVPs out there. Maybe they'll think of some really creative ways to use this if we make it a little more generic. So we've added a new step called download package content. And with this, you can add packages, driver packages, OS upgrade packages, or OS images into a single step and download those into a location that you desire. Now, in the case of upgrade, the use case here is that you can specify a couple of different steps with conditions. And on each step, you see down here at the bottom, it says save path as a variable. So you can specify a variable that's the same on those steps. And then you're dynamically acquiring your content, but making a single call to setup. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So the other new step is the actual upgrade step. So we have a whole new step just to run upgrade. You can specify a specific OS upgrade package, the specific media that's being used. You can specify a variable, as in this screenshot, or you can specify a network path or a local path. So if you want to do some custom stuff and put some, the media in a custom location, you can leverage that here. Same with the drivers. You've got some flexibility of where you put your drivers and how you acquire those. There are a few setup parameters that we're hard coding. I know some folks don't like the idea of hard coded parameters, but in the context of what we're doing with upgrade today, we actually have to hard code those. As I mentioned earlier, the slash auto upgrade, if we don't have that, then our client doesn't migrate. The no reboot is obvious. I mentioned the quiet post doobie, post rollback. We need those to restart the task sequence. Dynamic update, I talked about that a little bit ago. We are disabling that by default. You can check it if you're not using software update management in Config Manager. We also have an option there. If you want systems to actually go out to Windows Update, then we'll give you the option to override your policy and send systems out to the internet. Obviously, that doesn't scale really well for the enterprise, but in some instances, that might actually be beneficial. And then finally, if you're familiar with what we do with USMT, we give you a task sequence variable where you can specify additional setup command line parameters that will concatenate onto the end. We don't do any validation. You have to make sure you get it right, but we'll at least give you the ability to be able to add those on to the end. There are a bunch of other setup command line parameters that allow you to do some additional things. So if you have some custom needs there, you can add those on. All right, so I already talked through a lot of that, but let me just give you a look. I did switch, good. Okay, so OS upgrade packages. This is OS installers, just renamed. So if you're familiar with the OS installers, literally we just went through the UI and changed every instance of installer to upgrade package. The package itself is exactly the same. As you can see, you can still add older OS versions. There might be still some build and capture scenarios where you want to run setup. I wouldn't recommend it. You should just be using an install WIM as an OS image. But you can use it if you want to. So that's why we renamed it, is to try and guide folks towards, hey, this should really be used for the upgrade scenario. And there's no other change here. You just import it the exact same way you have in the past. Once you do that, then create a task sequence. And we have a new option here in the wizard, a new template to upgrade the OS from an upgrade package. And it's a very simple wizard. We give it the name. We specify the media. Now, you'll see in this instance, we're not filtering. It's a UI control thing. I asked the devs to do it, and it's just the framework as it is doesn't allow for that. So the good news is that if you do select 8, it will block you here. You can't go forward. Not the best experience, but it serves its purpose. We'll give you some details about the OSs that are inside of the image and the media. And then these are just the standard steps in creating a task sequence. You can specify to install updates, and if you wanted to add an application, you can do that just for sake of demo, good old Microsoft Math. And that's it. Now created a task sequence to do an upgrade. So let's look at what that default task sequence looks like. If you remember from what we looked at with MDT and what we looked at for the sample that we provided on TechNet, it's very similar, right? Doing all the same sort of things. We're using our new check readiness step it was new in R2 to add that in. Here's our new upgrade OS step, and then the additional steps that I specified during the wizard. If you look on these groups, you'll see we have some conditions here. This is what's determined as to whether which group is entered, depending upon the state of setup. So let me switch over and show you one that I've customized a little bit. So here you can see I've added the download package content steps. Actually, let me also show you, we've made one change to this UI. We've added a new menu option here for software. So the install app, install package, install software updates steps are now moved under this software node, along with the download package content. Instead of adding yet another step into the general area, we decided to shell it out into a whole new group. The upgrade OS step is under images. So if you go looking for that, if you want to do a custom process. So I've added the download package content here, and I've added a driver. Size is 0. This is just a demo package, if you're wondering. It's going to put that in the underscore SMS task sequence folder. I could specify another location if I wanted to, but you'll notice here I have a path for a variable for my drivers. And there would be a condition on this to only run on Surface devices. And then my other OEM that I use, I also specify that exact same variable name. And there would be a condition on this only for that OEM. And then on the upgrade operating system step, you can see here I've specified that single variable. So when this task sequence runs on a Surface, it'll grab the Surface drivers and it'll hand that Surface driver package off to setup to consume when it does the upgrade. And on the other OEM device, it'll do the same just for that driver package. So I get some dynamic flexibility as I deploy this. And then you can see one example of doing some sort of custom copy logs as part of the rollback. Okay. That, I believe, is all I wanted to show on upgrade in vNext. So what you just saw there, that's all coming in vNext of the product, which we announced earlier this week will be coming at the end of this Q4 this calendar year. So for the service pack, that's the more basic experience, the sample content that I walked through earlier, and then coming later this year is where you'll get that vNext experience. The vNext is also available as a tech preview, so you can go grab that and start playing around with this. Please provide us feedback on the tech preview. Go to Connect and file that feedback. So we talked about what's new in MDT. We talked about what's new in OSD. Hopefully you were able to take away that we're continuing to invest in both of those products and have listened to what our customers are complaining about and some of the pain points that they're hitting and are addressing those. Some related sessions. There's a bunch of good Windows 10 deployment stuff going on this week. Michael and Johan here up front, and I know Ronnie had a lab earlier with Kent. So there's a lot of great sessions going on. We've got an Ask the Experts here tomorrow afternoon that a bunch of us will be at. So if you've got deployment questions, we'll have a whole panel of folks to answer your questions. There's a bunch of, I mentioned already, Ronnie and Kent's lab. There's a bunch of other labs on deploying as well as upgrading. And there's, the hands-on lab that you can go and play around with yourself if you want to. So evals, I love evals. I love hearing your feedback. Please, please, please file evals. I love fives. Everyone loves a 5. But certainly let me know. The comments really are really what I like. I like hearing, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. It's really the comments that are what I enjoy. So use your QR code if you want. And I got 5 minutes left. So we got 5 minutes. If there's any questions, we got some mics here. You can just shout it out before we get kicked out. So question here. Multicast support for upgrade, no, because multicast is only a Pixie option. Can I go back 2 slides? Has everyone hit the QR code? If you don't know how to get to the evals, I guess. Is that what you wanted, Will? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, down here. Are you talking during the upgrade scenario? Okay, sorry, ask again then. I was thinking upgrade. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, so the question is around policy evaluation, compressing that between the PE client and the MP. You know, that's not how it's designed today. It's designed to be a little more dynamic and iterative like that. But it'd be good feedback, you know, something to file on Connect. Go ahead, go ahead. In general, or? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the question is around RBAC, role-based access, any improvements to vNext. I'm not sure if there's any general improvements. We did talk about it in the context of deployment verification, and the scope kind of exploded. So there's none of the, other than the fact that the deployment verification criteria is configured on the site properties, so only a site admin can specify those. But then all of the other warnings and stuff are part of the you know, the OSD admin would get those warnings. We did think about, hey, let's do RBAC on that checkbox. So only, you know, you have to have a specific right to be able to enable that. But it got really complex really quick. So RBACs on collections. Yeah, yeah, I think we've got that feedback. I don't know if it's another group, so I'm not sure if there's specific plans on that. There's a question over there. Sorry, can you repeat? Uh-huh. So in a refresh scenario, can you skip USMT? Right. Wipe and load, you still need USMT. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, nothing changes in the context of the wipe and load scenario. So yeah, if you're doing a wipe and load and you want to persist user data, you got to use USMT. The recommendation for what? Third-party disk encryption? That's a, well, yeah, so I mean, use BitLocker, that works really well. For third-party disk encryption, I know that there are some solutions available. I'm not sure how publicized they are. In some situations I have heard where you have to add a certificate and a driver into PE or even into WinRE inside of the, which is inside of the install WIM. So there's kind of a multi-layer thing where you have to get in and make some changes. That might be vendor specific though. So I think some, okay, so if you're using McAfee, there's a white paper on how to do it. I'd still recommend using BitLocker, but you know, might be biased. Back there, I guess, and then here and here. Can you do offline patching to a upgrade package? I don't believe so. Okay, so you can't, I think yes, you can technically do offline updates to the install.wim. I don't believe we actually expose that in our console though. So certainly something, you know, good DCR for the future that we'll need to add that. Yeah. You want to keep it up to date. Yep. Question here? No. That's the service packs that are coming in a week or so. They're released, yep. and then vNext is Q4 of this calendar year. Back there? Will upgrade work for internet-based? It's still technically an OSD scenario, which we don't support over internet-based. Might work, but so our own IT department has been asking about this as well. So they have a lot of remote systems. So it's feedback we've heard. Question over here. Specifically for OSD? So there was, yeah, the question is any, what else is changing in vNext versus what's changing in SP1? There was a session, the what's new and upcoming with Config Manager. They would have touched on stuff there. If they didn't, that was probably the best option there. Yeah, a lot of that might have been time, just time constraints. We do have a document. I know we have a document posted around what's in the vNext technical preview. That's up on, it's either our blog or on TechNet. There's a document for that. And shortly we'll have some documentation up around the service pack. Okay, so let's hold questions. We're a little over time. I want to cut all this off, and if there's more questions, we can meet out in the hall, and I can stick around for a while. Thanks, guys.